My name is Tiffany Clausen. Welcome to my discussion. I'm so excited that you've chosen to spend some time with me. So, as you have already read, I was a registered midwife for 12 years, and I used to be really happy with midwifery. I used to love my job and love supporting families. But I found over time that I wasn't as aligned with midwifery as I once had been, and I finally quit when I was on mat leave with my daughter. This was in 2020 during COVID, and things were starting to move online. So I thought, I love prenatal education, I love teaching. Why don't I make an online course? I'm not techie. I don't love technology. I'm not good at it. So it was quite the stumble for me, but YouTube was great for that. And I put out my first course, which was how to have a fulfilling birth within the system. I was still registered when I did this. And what this course actually taught me was that I couldn't go back to midwifery because as I dug into the evidence and researched interventions and care, I realized that midwifery wasn't evidence based and it wasn't going to go back to what it used to be. And that's ultimately what actually led me to resign my license. And in that year, I discovered traditional birth work. Even as a midwife, I had no idea that people were birthing outside the system. I used to believe that it was reckless. And as I learned more evidence and science and just that it all pointed back to physiology, I discovered a way of birthing that was really consistent with my ideals and what I thought midwifery would be, and probably what it was when it first started. So I feel like midwifery, regulated midwifery, has really lost a lot of credibility in the last few years. COVID really amplified and accelerated where midwifery was already headed. And to me, I believe the whole profession has lost its credibility. Women lost their support teams during COVID. They went to virtual, which women with women care cannot be virtual, and informed choice disappeared. So, as much as I believe that midwifery is not in a good place, I believe that what's coming out of this and what we're going to talk about today is where the change and where the good is going to happen. And I really believe in order for us to progress, we actually need to go back. So I'm going to start first with a little bit of a history and recap of obstetric care in the world and in Ontario as well. So a lot of this might be familiar just as a general history or herstory of obstetrics, but we'll go over it and then also in the Ontario context. So up until the 17th century, really all births were at home, led by traditional midwives. In the 17th century, male physicians began attending births of royalty and nobility. And then it became popular and novel to have male physicians because if royalty could afford it, then it must be something that the general public would benefit from. And then in the 18th century, that's when birth really started to move from homes to institutions. So at this point, it was still like in birthing clinics, most often still led by midwives. In the 19th century, as medicine moved into universities, and then only males were allowed to attend university, obstetrics became a medical discipline, and then majority of births were being encouraged to be attended by a physician in a hospital. There was an entire public health campaign to they had like magazine articles and newspaper articles that midwives were dirty, they were refugees who were unsafe, essentially encouraging women to deliver in these clean, sterile hospitals. At the same time, we have massive amounts of women who are dying from infection postpartum because these same physicians are doing autopsies. And then we didn't really have germ theory at this point, and then going to do vaginal exams and delivering. So for some of these physicians, they had 50% mortality rates. And then midwives who worked in the same institutions had much lower rates because they weren't doing autopsies, they weren't physicians. In the mid 20th century, we didn't really have legalized midwifery at all in Canada, but the government began to recruit nurse midwives to work in rural and remote areas. So the general public could pay for midwifery, it wasn't illegal. They couldn't attend hospitals, obviously, but you could just pay out of pocket. But the government did provide nurse midwives to rural areas who did more like nursing care, sort of like called a midwife. In the 60s and 80s, as we started to have, the revolution of civil rights, human rights, birth rights, there was a desire more for natural birth. Midwifery started to become more accepted. and there was a push to regulate midwifery in Ontario. In the 80s, there was a task force that was really committed to getting midwifery regulated, and I have a few quotes actually from there in a moment. But it took a few years. So 91, the Midwifery Act was passed. So Ontario was the first province to regulate midwifery, but it wasn't until 94 that came into effect because things move really slowly within the government. 94 was the first year in January that midwifery was funded by OHIP, and midwives could move into hospital. They had hospital privileges, so if a woman transferred, they could continue care. So, why was there a push to regulate midwifery? This is a quote from the report of the Task Force on the Implementation of Midwifery in Ontario from 1987, talking about the push again to regulate midwifery. These consumers believed that midwives, by virtue of their education, their philosophy, and perhaps their sex, were better able to provide holistic maternity care in which pregnancy and childbirth were regarded as normal physiologic events and medical interventions such as episiotomy and cesarean section were minimized. Such beliefs were leading to a renaissance of interest in midwifery across North America and a rethinking of maternity care in much of the developed world. So you can see that the motivation and intention behind regulating midwifery was pure and good, and we'll talk about sort of how that's changed over time. But unfortunately, midwifery was moving into a system that was strongly paternalistic. Paternalism means restricting someone else's freedoms or responsibilities for their own good. That was really one of the foundations of moving birth into the institutions because doctors felt that they knew better than midwives and they needed to take care of women in order for them to have safe birth. So with this paternalistic perspective and treatment of women, we also, our mothers, our grandmothers, our great-grandmothers, our ancestors, bought into the promise that if we followed the formula of this sort of care and these ultrasounds and this testing, then we would be promised a healthy baby because that's what they told us, right? But we were willing participants at some points. Like women were the ones who advocated and fought for pain management in birth. Often, and as we're seeing, that when we advocate for things that are interventions, they often come with the side effects that we were not aware of. We were not informed. Things like twilight seat and scopolamine, things like that. As women, we bought into this formula. We, at the end, sometimes weren't handed a healthy baby, or moms died, because that still happens. Moms and babies will always have risk in birth because it is a rite of passage. What happened was that women were encouraged to sue. So as litigation started to build and more generations sued because they didn't get the outcome they were promised, this increased the fear of liability in healthcare. In obstetrics, I am convinced after being in the system, has become the driving force behind policy and procedure, and which is why we have really moved away from evidence-based family care, if there ever was that. I think there was. That seemed to be in the 80s and 90s. Rates of maternal perinatal mortality were decreasing. C-section rates weren't what they were now. We were actually at a much better space than we're in right now. But this fear of litigation, fear of liability now has taken over those who practice within the modern obstetric system. So I would like to show you some of the liability insurance fees of obstetricians so that you can see how this is represented in their fees, which is easily double than any other healthcare practitioner. So the CMPA is a mutual medical defense organization for Canadian physicians. And essentially it would provide lawyers for the physician and the healthcare team as well as the patient so that both sides are equally represented. It would provide the sum of money if there was a win in court. So you can see down at the bottom of the first photo that obstetricians are number 93. On all these charts, they're number 93. And then when you go to the image on the right, if you fall over to the second column, which is Ontario fees, their yearly fees in order to cover their insurance is $58,000. And you can see the next highest right above it is 32. It's nowhere close to what other healthcare providers are paying for insurance because of this liability and this history of families suing when they don't get the outcome they're promised. The next few images are also previous years. You can see in 2023, they were still double, but they had actually dropped a lot. They were down to 23,000. 2022, they were again back up to 53,000. So there's a couple years where the fees really dropped. And I tried to figure out why that was and found this on the CMPA website. So essentially, the fees for their insurance are governed by the stock market. And so because the stocks have dropped in the last couple of years because of COVID, their fees went down and they're actually back up. And I love this. I don't love this, but this quote in bold really speaks about our system. It says, additionally, medical legal costs have steadily increased across the country. So back to those 2024 fees for obstetricians who are providing birth care, $58,000 just for their insurance. So you can imagine if you were a provider, an obstetrician, providing care to birthing families with an incredibly expensive insurance premium, you would be doing what you can to reduce liability. And how do we reduce liability in the realistic obstetric world? You do what you can to get that baby from the belly to the bassinet as fast as you can. Let's look at some stats. So this slide is from my online course, from both my courses. My most recent one, it's updated the total prenatal prep for birthing outside the system in Ontario. So these are cesarean rates over the last 25 or so years. You can see the rate overall in Canada has gone from about 17% in 1995 up to the latest data that is published online is 31% in 2020. So again, this is all in that attempt for OBs to get that baby out into the bassinet. Essentially, they can wash their hands of you after. Once that baby is out, it's safe, it's in the bassinet, it's alive, their risk of liability really does decrease. In Ontario, our rates have gone from 28.4% in 2009 to 31%, so definitely increasing. Chatham has terrible C-section rates, and I think they're even higher now. As of 2021, 43.3% of moms who walked into the hospital labor and delivery walked out with a C-section. Woodstock in 2021, 29%, and London, 27.2%. So you can see some of those locales are higher than the Ontario statistic, and then some are lower. The World Health Organization recommends a cesarean rate of 10 to 15% and says essentially that if a C-section rate is over 15%, you're not improving outcomes. Most researchers would say about 20% is appropriate in a modern population. None of these locales are even close to that. So I want to show you how this is reflected in our maternal and perinatal mortality rates. This is from Canada overall. It doesn't break down province by province at StatsCan. So we've got Canadian stats from 2000 to 2022. Figured that was enough time to see trends. So mortality rates for maternal mortality rates are essentially how many moms die per 100,000 live births. And then perinatal mortality, which is where either baby it's after 20 weeks or within the first 28 days postpartum. Those are per 1,000 live births. So you can see Canadian maternal mortality rates are actually really increasing. You've got from 3.3% in 2000 up to 8 and 9% in the last couple of years. For our perinatal mortality rates, our babies are pretty stable. Canadian overall, pretty close to 6. It hasn't really changed. Ontario has gone down actually from 6.7 to 5.7, so that's a whole baby less. So it's interesting in this push to get the baby from the belly to the bassinet. We aren't actually harming babies in terms of mortality, but look what's happening to our moms. So not only are more women dying in childbirth, in Canada, 1/3 of women are actually walking away with birth trauma, according to this one study. And that can be emotional, physical, psychological, spiritual, or health-related consequences of a traumatic birth experience. About 10% of these women are actually walking away with full-blown PTSD, although some of the symptoms of trauma are very similar to a diagnosable PTSD. So what makes a birth traumatic? We must understand that trauma is subjective. It's like beauty. Beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. It could be danger to life or limb. So, a life-threatening hemorrhage, a baby that ends up in the NICU. But typically, trauma in birth is due to feelings of powerlessness, fear, pain, abuse, and feeling unsupported. Let's talk a little bit about the health effects of trauma. We've got postpartum depression and anxiety, substance abuse, chronic pain, heart disease, gastrointestinal disease, respiratory disease, cancer, suicidal ideation and attempts, and future birth problems. So even if a mom has trauma in one birth, she's actually more likely to have a preterm birth and low birth weight in her subsequent pregnancies. And I want you to look at this next stat. So the rise in maternal mortality is all captured in the rise in moms dying after 42 days postpartum. It's not in birth, and it's not immediate postpartum. Look at in 2020 to 2021, 2022. Those rates have quadrupled, and that is represented by increased rates of suicide. So how do we prevent birth trauma? And these slides here are also from my online course. There are 4 predictors of a satisfying birth. First one is personal expectations, were they met? This is the prenatal education piece. What are you expecting to happen? What are you expecting? Interventions are expecting? How are you expecting to be treated? Number 2 is the amount of support from your caregivers. And number 3 is the quality of the relationship with you and your caregiver. So those can be different. You can have an amazing relationship with your care provider, and then when you get into hospital or even at home, all of a sudden they're backtracking on their support, or they're relinquishing control to an obstetrician, and you're losing that support that you thought you previously had. And predictor 4 is the involvement in decision making. What's happening is that these predictors of a satisfying birth are not seen at birth anymore, which is why 1/3 of women are walking away with birth trauma, and our rates of suicide and perinatal mortality are increasing. Something has happened here. The women are not getting the care and the support that maybe they once had, or they thought they were going to get. We can ask ourselves, why has midwifery assimilated to this? I understand that this might be the way with obstetricians, but why are midwives not able to practice how they originally intended to practice? And it's really quite simple. In order for midwives to be able to do their job and be regulated by the college and to keep their license, they have to have hospital privileges. In order for them to keep their hospital privileges, they have to follow policy and procedure, which always will take precedence over client wishes and individual care. This means that there's a little bit of a bait and switch. This isn't always intentional. Midwives might enter care with a client wanting to support their wishes, but when it gets time for the rubber to hit the road, they're not able to actually do it in order to keep their job. Let's spend a few minutes talking about this bait and switch. Again, it's not always intentional. But Ontario's midwifery model of care is based on 3 principles: continuity of care, informed choice, and choice of birthplace. And this is all from the Association of Ontario Midwives website. These are considered the pillars of midwifery in Ontario. So you've got continuity of care, informed choice, and choice of birthplace. And I've explained those there again with their own words. Meaning continuity of care that once a client enters care, she has the same team of midwives up until 6 weeks postpartum. Informed choice, midwives support clients to make informed decisions about their care. This is what we're going to talk about a little bit. And then choice of birthplace, meaning that women can give birth at home or hospital. The reality is not so simplistic. This was the College of Midwives of Ontario clinical practice guideline called When a Client Chooses Care Outside Midwifery Standards of Practice. It was made in 2014. I have these screenshots, and I'm actually really happy that I have these screenshots because it was rescinded just this year, which is good because it's a terrible standard. But this is the reality of how midwives practice. They had written within their standards that if a client requests care outside of what a midwife is comfortable with, they can fire her. And this was happening all the time during COVID. If clients didn't want prenatal screening and wants a home birth, they could fire her. Since they have archived this standard as of last year, I'm not sure exactly when they did, they now have a waiver policy where midwives can actually fill out a form and apply to have approval to not meet certain standards. And I'm not sure when this is used, but this would be the new way that they go about potentially, firing a client that isn't following the recommendations. There's obviously going to be other reasons, but this is the one that they have in its place. And this was essentially the reason I left regulated midwifery. I felt that dissonance, that I could not serve my clients and follow the rules of the hospital and my college. I could not serve 2 masters. And this is a quote from another regulated midwife who's within the system, obviously anonymous, who's feeling that same tension. So working in the system, it feels impossible to serve women the way I truly want, while also working by the rules of said system, whether that be the CMO or individual hospital, which are two separate entities, yet both equally powerful and dictate my ability to work. Discussing community standards doesn't always line up with best evidence, or especially intuition. But in order to protect my license, I find myself having to word things in a certain way that may not always align with my true feelings. It's a dirty, messy, and complicated place for me to be morally and ethically. Yet I do feel strongly that there are women out there who can't or won't, for a multitude of reasons, birth outside the system, and who want to stand up and advocate for themselves and the birth that they want. I'm hoping I can genuinely assist these women into the birthing circumstances that are best for them on their terms, and have them feel like they can find support within a system that isn't set up to best serve them and their babies. This is another quote by a registered midwife who has actually chosen to leave midwifery like me. I am leaving registered midwifery because I can no longer turn a blind eye to the harm that is being done by midwives who prioritize their fears and obsession with reducing risk of liability over a woman's right to the pregnancy and birth she feels is best for her. It's not only unsafe for clients, the medicalized model of midwifery is also unsafe for any midwife who dares to speak out against the mainstream narratives. I can no longer go along with the harm being done to women and babies. This is not midwifery. These are trained midwives practicing low-risk obstetrics. I see no difference between the medical midwives and obstetric care providers. The system is no longer for me. And this is what midwives who aren't feeling aligned are experiencing every day in our system. Eventually, we have to choose whether we continue to be a part of the system or we disengage like I did. So we heard from a midwife who's having to work in the system. What about former midwifery clients? Here are some quotes that really encapsulate what women are feeling within the midwifery system. While in the care midwives, I had several things I wanted to do differently than the usual policies. The midwives pushed back and actually pushed fear tactics on me for those choices rather than showing support for my evidence-based choices. This is someone who had a baby in 2018 and 2023. My fourth child, but first hospital birth experience, was one where I witnessed the power and politics of birth, hierarchy, and the pressure of intervention play out in real time. It became deeply apparent that my midwife was more interested in protecting her hospital privileges and complying with the OB, timelines, and even arguing with my doula that something with my body was defective since I was in hospital. Various realities in this birth experience broke my trust in midwifery, in the system, and in what I was being told as truth. At the end of the day, it wasn't really about what was best for me or my baby. It was about what was best for the staff and the system. And this final quote is from someone who reached out recently who's had a lot of babies in the system with midwives. And she said, I do notice that maybe midwifery is being sucked into the system more recently, and I do not feel as safe with them as I once did. Here's another really poignant quote about someone who accessed care from midwives and OBs, and I'll leave it here. But essentially, the system has put people like me in a really weird box because I was initially not very comfortable with the idea of home birth. But now having gone through the system twice, I can honestly say I probably feel safer at home. So it's very palpable in modern obstetrics, this tension between fear of liability and individual needs and desires. And just as an interesting aside, I've been reading this book called Blindsight is 2020. I've been reading it for a few months now, just kind of perusing through it. The subtitle is Reflections on COVID Policies from Dissident Scientists, Philosophers, and Artists. And there was a quote I read in here the other day that I feel like just totally mirrored what we're seeing in obstetrics. Let me read it for you. Why do governments grab power? Some people say it's just what they do. Horses run, governments seek control. But government actions also reflect the will of the people. We saw this play out with COVID. Government overreach happened because people let it happen. They looked to their leaders to make it all better, to stop every preventable death from COVID. Preventable. And the leaders feared an angry mob if they didn't deliver. When people blame their leaders for every death, when they regard a risk-free environment as their birthright and insist their government provide it, politicians will naturally seek to protect themselves from liability. Viewed through this lens, the institutional response to COVID was nothing more than giant cover-your-ass operation. This is exactly what's happened to obstetrics. So like I mentioned earlier, COVID amplified and accelerated the trajectory of midwifery, and people are waking up. I had this realization the other night when I was in bed. I bought this beautiful piece of art from Amanda Gravette. It's a print, but she's a Ontario artist who does birth art. And I bought it probably 10, 12 years ago when it used to sit in my midwifery office. Now it's here at home in my office. I'm going to show it here. There's just a copy. I just saw sadness in her. There's joy, but there's sadness. And something about this picture really struck me. And Amanda, on the flip side of this print, wrote a quote from Leonard Cohen's song Anthem. And it reads, "Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." And lying in bed the other night, I realized, that is what's happening. There is a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. And so I actually looked up a little bit of the meaning behind his song. And Leonard Cohen's not known for really explaining his poetry. Most people don't, because the whole point is that it's up to us to figure out meaning. But he wrote this about the song Anthem. The future is no excuse for an abdication of your personal responsibilities towards yourself and your job and your love. Ring the bells that still can ring. They're few and far between, but you can find them. This situation does not admit of solution of perfection. This is not the place where you make things perfect. Neither in your marriage, nor your work, nor anything, nor your love of God, nor your love of family or country. The thing is imperfect. And worse, there is a crack in everything that you put together. Physical objects, mental objects, constructions of any kind. But that's where the light gets in. And that's where the resurrection is. And that's where the return. That's where there's repentance. And it is with the confrontation with the brokenness of things. Women are waking up. There is a crack in everything and the light is getting in. And women are becoming birth industry disruptors. A disruptor is typically a company or technology that causes radical change in an existing industry or market by means of innovation. But you women are disrupting the way of birth by going back to what was meant to be. I even believe this in women who end up transferring to hospital after a free birth that needed care or needed more medical attention, or for whatever reason they intuitively felt like they needed to move in. We're disrupting. You're disrupting when you move in. It's uncomfortable and ugly, but it's rocking the boat. And I really feel like this crack, things are going to change because they have to. Okay, I'm interrupting this presentation with something breaking and really important. I've already recorded this. It was ready for launch. It's ready for launch tomorrow morning, and I just received some really important data. So about a month ago, I made a data service request to Vital Statistics Ontario because I wanted to see what the trend was in Ontario families who are registering their baby through serviceontario.ca/newborn and putting that there was no provider present. Understanding that this would also capture people who delivered precipitously at home without a provider, like not planning to. So those that just go too fast and then they call EMS. It captures those. The data also says it captures people who have a nurse practitioner present, which I think in Ontario is very, very rare. We don't really have a lot of nurse practitioners who are offering home birth. I can't think of any, which if they do, that's fantastic. But I think over time, my whole goal was to see what the trend was in free birth, because that's the number it's going to capture. And the numbers are pretty amazing. So less than I thought, but it doesn't include the 2023 statistic. So we've got 2018, 2019, 2021, 22. That's the most recent you can get data through Statistics Ontario. And we can see from 2022 to 2020, it doubles. And from 2018 to 2022, it triples. It's also really important to remember that our birth rates are dropping. Not significantly, but they're on a downward trend. So as the amount of births are coming down, the amount of free births are going up, which makes it even more significant. This is how I know that women are waking up. The data shows it, and I'm so excited to have this because I think this is the first time in Ontario we actually have proof instead of just rumors and people seeing it happening. And I think the number when 2023 is available is going to be so much bigger than 2022 because it's the year I started, supporting families at home. Billie Harrigan would have had her first graduating class out in the world supporting families. And I know that's when I met the majority of birth workers that I know is when they started practicing was 2023. So I think this is super exciting, but now let's get back to regular programming. Where is funded midwifery going? I don't know. I don't know if it's just going to come to a point where less women choose midwifery and more are free birthing. Part of me wonders if it will lose funding as our economy worsens. And midwifery was always known for having good outcomes, better outcomes. And I really wonder if outcomes of midwives are starting to parallel those of OBs, and the government will look at midwifery as a redundancy. I don't know. But where do we go from here? Where do women go from here? Do we want to keep walking away from birth with 1/3 of us having trauma? Or do we want to demand a better way? I know that rates of birthing outside the system are increasing. This is apparent in the amount of women who are supporting birth. But it's up to us to create the change and be the disruptor. In taking part of the summit, you already understand your role in disrupting birth. But I also want to urge you to take some time to work through the worksheet that I've attached that really encourages you to look at your local resources and see where you can impact your community even more. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because I think midwifery is imploding, and I think it needs to. I would love for it to go back to where it was intentioned, but I honestly don't think it can. I think anything we've seen that is government mandated, government regulated, government controlled cannot serve women. And I think that we're finally taking responsibility for this and changing the patterns and the cycles in our own families. So I want to thank you again for joining me in this discussion. I'm hopeful for the future. I think it's going to be uncomfortable. And like any transition, there's pain and there's just like birth, there's labor pains. But what comes in the morning is beautiful. And we all have a responsibility and a role in this change, whether you are having babies, affecting change through mothers groups or community prenatals, or just speaking truth to family members or on social media. We all have a role to play in this. And I want you to see how important it is for the safety and the well-being of women in order to not have this trauma and these rise in suicide rates. We have to do something about this, and I think the change is happening. Hopefully I'll see some of you in my courses. I'll see you hopefully on Instagram. Reach out if you need anything. My email is available. I am pretty accessible. And thank you for honoring me with your time.